Welcome to the Grammar Extra Credit. I do this as extra credit primarily because at the beginning of a quarter, a lot of students will ask me if we can cover grammar or mechanics or punctuation within the quarter. I don't focus on it a whole lot in my classes primarily because it's something that we can pick up along the way. There are great tools to continue to learn this. If you're using Grammarly in a certain way, Grammarly can help you identify these errors. So this is just extra credit, help you go over some major errors that I see students and other writers fall victim to. So common errors are things like semicolons and periods, commas, tone, repetition, capitalization, and then active and passive voice. And we'll cover all of those here. But before we can get to that, we're going to look at a fancy and somewhat scary sounding grammar term, independent clauses. So the question is, what the heck is an independent clause? So an independent clause is another way of saying a complete sentence, something that can stand on its own. An example being the penguin exploded or the students did not want to take their final exam. Those are complete sentences. I could walk up to somebody and say that and they would have a clear idea of what I meant, even if it might be a little bit jarring to say that a penguin exploded. So a complete sentence or an independent clause has a subject, so a noun, which is a person, place, or thing. It has a verb, which is an action word, and then it expresses a complete thought. So the example here, Joe said, that has a subject, technically, and it has a verb, technically, but it does not express a complete thought. If I came up to somebody and said, Joe said, there's no further context. It's not a complete thought. Instead, I need to say what Joe said. Joe said he was hungry, and then I have a complete thought. Now, the opposite of a complete sentence is an incomplete sentence, which is often called a fragment. So, went to the store is not a sentence, although a lot of people will write this way. And contextually, it might make sense. A text message or an email, something like that, certain circumstances might make sense, but here we don't know who went to the store. Same with the second one here. We don't know who ate the pie. And, knowing that would help us decide whether or not they've been rude in eating it or not. Now, with a sentence, of course, sentence ends with a period. Complete thought, period. Or full stop if you learned in a British English country. Now, one thing that we can do, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this, is we could use a semicolon. In general, semicolons and periods are interchangeable. We would use a semicolon wherever we could use a period, generally for stylistic reasons. There is one occasion when you have to use a semicolon, and that's in a list where a lot of commas would make it confusing. And if you want to know more, let me know. We can talk about that later. But speaking of commas, I would say that commas are one of the things that most people get wrong. There's some bad advice about there, like put a comma anywhere you would hear a pause. That comes from the origin of where commas sort of came into the punctuation idea. But I think it's difficult because you can start to hear a pause anywhere. So these are things that you should know. You should know at least a few of these already. We need them in a list. So between a series of things in a list where there are 3 or more things, and for what it's worth, I believe in the Oxford comma or the serial comma, which is the last comma after eggs and before and in my first example here. It's not a requirement, but I think it's good practice, FYI. After an introductory clause, so an introductory clause is also just kind of a fragment that starts a sentence, and it's something that adds additional information. After we won the game, comma, we went to the store to buy donuts. A good way to think about this is I could actually take that first chunk and put it at the end. We went to the store to buy donuts after we won the game, and I could get rid of that comma. After a transition word, so a transition word like however, therefore, whatever transition word you want, because we still need to buy milk, is a complete sentence. The however allows us to transition from one sentence to another. In number 4 here, an appositive is just an extra chunk of information. So I could read number 4 and it would make sense without the appositive. Michael taught us how to use commas. If, for clarity, I want to add information into that, but it's not absolutely essential, it just helps, that becomes an appositive or sort of a side. Michael, the English professor, taught us how to use commas. And then before our coordinating conjunctions, most of the time, before a word like for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, we're going to include a comma. Good practice. There you go. Okay. So tone. Tone is another one that I think is increasingly important in the world in which we live, especially as we navigate or shift gears from, say, social media or informal communication to academic writing. And there's a lot of discussion about this that could take up a whole hour or 2 hours, and I don't want to do that to you today, but I'm more than happy to talk about the complexities of tone. I want to give you a couple good rules of thumb. Number 1, I always suggest that people avoid the second person in their writing unless they're talking to somebody very specific. For example, in this video, I can say, you should pay attention to academic tone because I'm talking to a group of individuals, you all, who are students in my class who want to learn about grammar or at least get the extra credit. I also suggest that you avoid the first person unless you have some additional experience which lends to the meaning or what you're trying to convey. In this case, again, for example, I might use the first person pronoun because I'm speaking to you as the professor of the class and somebody who is trying to help you further understand grammar. Okay, a couple more. We're getting there. So repetition. Repetition is something that happens quite a lot. It will weaken your writing because good writing is clear, efficient, effective writing, right? So it should be easy enough to avoid. I know sometimes we do this because we're trying to hit a word count or page limit or what have you. But if I say the cookies were stolen by the cookie thieves, only the cookie thieves would steal cookies, and whoever stole them, whether or not they were a cookie thief before, is now a cookie thief. So there you have it. We worked all day from morning to night. Morning to night is part of all day, so we could get rid of that second part. Nice, short, concise sentence. Okay, active voice and passive voice. Maybe you've heard this before, maybe you haven't. Again, like tone, it's one where there's a lot of discussion about how, when, where we might use one. However, I will tell you that within the academic and professional environment, the tendency is to prefer active voice, with some people even going so far as to say you should never use passive voice. So, if that's the case, what the heck is passive voice? So, in active voice, the subject is acting, right? So we talked about in a sentence we need a subject and a verb. In other words, the subject is doing the thing. In passive, it's the other way around, right? So a couple ways to think about this, but an example in active voice would be Joe kicked the aardvark. That's active. Joe is doing something. And in the second one, it's passive. The aardvark was kicked by Joe. Now, what you can see here is that it actually creates a longer sentence. There are cases and instances in which passive voice does make sense. If you're curious, let me know. All right, capitalization should be an easy one. Most grammar checkers will catch this automatically, but I still see a lot of capitalization issues in student writing, so just make sure that something like Shoreline Community College, the S, the C, and the second C are all capitalized because Shoreline Community College itself is that proper noun. You can see the other ones here as well. So there are, of course, cases in which something is a common noun, not a proper noun. So community college, if we're just talking about community colleges in general, or high schools in general, or books in general, no capital. In general, we no longer capitalize internet, and earth is only really capitalized if you're talking about the planet. All right, last thing, we get a bonus. All right, this is one I see a lot, and I think it's easy enough to avoid, and it's one of those things that will make your writing look more professional, sound more professional, especially for those people who know about the difference. So, it's IT apostrophe S is actually a contraction of it is. So if you can replace it's with it is, it's IT apostrophe S. It's, and this is where it gets strange, ITS without an apostrophe is the possessive form. Like, the ball lost its air. The air belongs to the ball. However, we don't use an apostrophe. Long and short of it, Reader's Digest version, his, hers, theirs, we also don't use an apostrophe, so chunk it into that same category. IT apostrophe S, or sorry, ITS apostrophe is not a thing, so you should never ever write that, especially if you want to make sure that you look and sound professional. Then last little one here is a dangling modifier, another grammar word, but if I read this first example, while eating pizza, the phone rang. Technically, what that says is that while the phone was eating pizza, it rang. That's not what we intended to say. What we intended to say, while we were eating pizza, the phone rang. So there you go. A little bit longer than I wanted this video to be, but I've been meaning to re-record this one for quite a while. So if you have questions about these, let me know. In order to get the extra credit, make sure that you take the quiz, take your time. You can kind of go back and look at this video as needed. If any of these things are still unclear to you, please send me an email or let me know in some other way so that I can help you clarify. All right, there you go. Have a good one. Talk to you later.